In today's episode, I'll be covering the tragic case of Dylan Redwine and making a classic Colorado dish, vegan chile. If you want to practice your chef skills, the recipe will be in the description box down below. I think we can all agree that divorce can be super messy. Whether you're a couple splitting up or you're a child of divorce, it affects everyone differently. And for Mack Redwine, he would take his frustrations to a terrifying level and end the life of his 13-year-old son, Dylan. Even Dr. Phil got involved with his case. That's how you know it's serious. All right, for the dish, we're gonna start with some oil. Go ahead, put it in your pan. Now, I don't know if any of you have been to Colorado, but it's seriously one of the most beautiful places. And our case takes place in Durango, Colorado, which is a 7-hour drive from the capital city of Denver. On February 6th, 1999, Dylan Redwine was born to parents Mack and Elaine. They gave birth to one other child before him, a boy named Corey. Dylan and Corey had a couple of half-siblings because Mack was married once before. But Mack couldn't make his second marriage work. And after 18 years of marriage, he and Elaine pursued a divorce. To give you more backstory, Mack was a truck driver, which meant he would be gone for really long periods of time. All right, so I think that my oil is heated up, so let's go ahead and add the onion. I'm just gonna toss that in. But Mack and Elaine divorced, and it wasn't cute, like, at all. It was mean, messy, and vindictive. Their 2 sons were in the middle of a custody battle, and as you can imagine, a couple who doesn't like each other very much is gonna use one of those kids as pawns. So the judge dealing with the divorce and custody case asked to talk with Dylan to see who he really wanted to live with. This is a common practice. It's very important to get the child's opinion. It's also a chance for the judge to see the kid without their parents breathing down their neck. A lot of the time, kids will almost have a planned out speech that they were taught by one of their parents. Dylan was very brave and told the judge that he didn't want to live with his dad, Mack. They had a really uncomfortable and painful, awkward relationship after the divorce happened. In fact, Mack had a really strained relationship with all of his children, from the marriage and the previous one. Dylan said he didn't like being around his dad and asked to live with his mom, Elaine, instead. The judge took all of this into consideration and granted custody to Elaine. This obviously made Mack super angry. He was still granted visitation rights, but to Mack, this wasn't about who got the kids. He just wanted to one-up Elaine and shove it in her face. It's a way to hurt Elaine. All right, on that note, let's go ahead and add our celery. Yummy! We're gonna add our bell pepper as well. And maybe we'll let that sit for a second. Mack booked a flight for Dylan to come visit him around Thanksgiving. And even though they all lived in Colorado, Durango was pretty far, so flying was the best option. Dylan was not happy about any of this, and it didn't help that he had to go alone. His older brother Corey was 18, which meant he was allowed to make his own decisions, including the one to skip out on the trip because he didn't want to visit his father. The last time Dylan saw his father, they didn't do anything except argue about the divorce. But Dylan did his best to avoid his dad, even asking him if he could sleep over at a friend's house. Mack, of course, said no, but then Dylan went on to make plans with his friends for the next day at 6:30 a.m. All right, let's take this time to add our jalapenos. A little bit of spice. And I'm gonna add a soy sauce to make it a little bit salty. This kid was not going to spend more time with his dad than he had to. The next day, according to Mack, Dylan slept in and never went to see his friend. At around 11:30 a.m., Mack left the house to run some errands, and when he arrived back to the house, Dylan wasn't there. Mack didn't think anything was strange, even though the door was open, the TV was still on, Dylan's phone and backpack were still there, and there was a half-eaten bowl of cereal left out. He assumed that Dylan had left to go hang out with his friend in the time that he was gone. So it was the perfect time for a nap. Sometime around 1:30 p.m., Mack woke up from his slumber and realized that Dylan still wasn't at the house. He tried contacting him multiple times, but Dylan didn't have his phone. Then Mack went to a few friends' houses to see if they knew where Dylan was, but no one did. And they couldn't get in contact with him either. At that point, Dylan was gone, and Mack didn't have any clue where he could be. So Mack decided to contact the police. Keep in mind, this was Dylan's first day in Durango, and he's already missing. Mack texted his ex-wife, Elaine, to let her know what was going on, and he asked if she had any idea where Dylan was. Elaine lived in Colorado Springs, which is about a 6-hour drive from Mack and Durango. She knew something was wrong, so she jumped in the car and headed for Durango. As soon as she got there, she went to the sheriff's office, and at like 1 a.m., they started searching around Mack's house. But get this, Mark didn't want to help. He stayed inside while everybody else was searching for Dylan, the missing 13-year-old boy, Mark's son. Well, Dylan's friend that he was supposed to hang out with hadn't heard from Dylan either. He got the text the night before, and no response the following morning. Mark, being the genius that he is, said that he thought Dylan had either walked to a nearby campground or his friend's house. This is interesting because the friend's house was almost 10 miles away. Dylan is a small, young boy. Why the heck would he walk to his friend's house? Sure, you could say that he wanted to do whatever he could do to get away from his father, but it's the middle of November. It's so insanely cold in Colorado at this time, it makes no sense that he would walk all the way without any of his things. It doesn't add up. The police started to think that maybe Dylan really did just run away, but the day after he arrived in Durango, he would have reached out to his mom if he was that unhappy, and Elaine smelled something fishy right from the jump. Sadly, days and days went by, and even the search teams doing their best, Dylan was gone, and there was no trace. And you know that saying, nothing beats a mother's intuition? Elaine knew Mark had something to do with his son's disappearance, because nothing from his story was adding up. Mark claimed that his fishing pole was missing from the house and suspected Dylan had taken it with him when he left. Here's the thing. Dylan had no previous experience with fishing. Why would he have taken that and not his cell phone? About a week after Thanksgiving, search teams were still looking for anything that could potentially lead them to Dylan. Eventually, a group of search dogs picked up a scent around Vallecito Lake, which was in the middle of a huge group of foothills and mountains. They brought out divers to do the search in the area, but they went home empty-handed. And during this time, Mark wasn't being helpful in the slightest. He wouldn't go out and look. He wasn't canvassing neighborhoods. It just seemed like all this wasn't a big deal to him. Meanwhile, even Dylan's half-brother and his family from Arizona came out to help with the search. Elaine knew that Mark had something to do with it, or at least knew something more than he was saying. But of course, he denied. He said he left to run errands, and when he'd returned, Dylan was gone. He claimed that if police wanted to search his house, all they had to do was ask. He wouldn't go any further than that. Okay, now that my veggies have cooked down a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and add the broth. Put that in there and then wait for it to boil a little bit. A few days later, investigators went to Mark's home and found drops of Dylan's DNA. Mark's girlfriend covered and said that it was left over from a year ago when Dylan had sliced his finger. The police took a few pieces from Mark's home to go and test it, and they brought him in for questioning, a pretty standard procedure. But Mark thought he was already a suspect and that they were already after him. Both he and Elaine were given polygraph tests. Elaine passed hers, but Mark didn't do so hot. He was actually told that he had, and I quote, failed miserably. A lot of time had passed since Dylan had gone missing. Both Elaine and her oldest son, Corey, flat out accused Mark of knowing more than he was admitting, and they went as far as saying Mark hurt Dylan. Oh, and Mark also never showed up to any of the vigils that were held. And what does good old Mark Redwine do? Deny the whole thing, but refuse to offer up any information. So it is bubbling a little bit, so I'm going to add the diced tomatoes with the bell pepper. While on the Dr. Phil show, Mark was asked if he would take another polygraph test. And if you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't be scared to answer some questions, right? And at first, Mark said that he was down. The room was set up, the professionals were there, and he said he was ready to put all of us to rest once and for all. But at the very last second, he refuses and backs out of the polygraph test. Since Dylan went missing during the winter, so many areas were covered in ice and snow and would have to wait until spring when it melted to keep searching. And in June of 2013, officers would continue the search for days. All right, so I'm gonna add the miso paste and let that cook down when this begins to boil. Just going to help it by stirring at the bottom right here. Eventually, towards the end of June, they would tell Dylan's family that they had possibly found his remains very close to Mark Redwine's home. But they only found partial remains in a really difficult to search area. It was clear that whoever put his body out here knew that a wild animal would probably destroy any remaining evidence. And since it had been 6 months, it was really difficult to pinpoint a cause. All right, time for carrots. It wasn't until 2015 that Mark's home would be searched for a second time and that he would be brought in as a major person of interest. But one thing that would continue to be questioned was what the heck was the motive? If Mark really did do this, What was his reasoning? Going so far as to end the life of your own child is the most extreme thing that you can do. The community was devastated by what happened to Dylan, and people were pretty positive that Mark had something to do with it. His alibi, the statements he was making, his violent outbursts, there was just so much that pointed to Mark being a suspect. In you go. In November of 2015, more of Dylan's remains had been found, this time by a local hiker who stumbled across his skull in the middle of the mountains. While examiners were looking into this, they found evidence of blunt force trauma to the head, along with a fracture above the eye. Animals don't do this, so that ruled out the wildlife theory. When officials changed the cause to a homicide, Mark tried to cover his ass and say that someone had placed Dylan's remains there in an attempt to make him look guilty. And Mark started to get super paranoid. He even took a video of himself in the forest, demonstrating how someone could have killed his son. Then he posted the video everywhere on social media for everyone and their dog to see. All right, now we're gonna add a grain. Lentils are my favorite, so red lentils are going in. In 2017, police finally had enough evidence to arrest Mark. He was arrested in Washington at the time because he was a truck driver, so he was arrested there and then brought back to Colorado. Mark would be described as a narcissistic psychopath who would never admit fault. And wouldn't you know, in court, Mark denied all of the charges, even though everything was pointing to him. If this case hasn't frustrated you yet, wait until you find out that the trial was rescheduled 10 times. In fact, in 2019, Mark's attorney was arrested because of assault charges, which only pushed the trial back further until 2020. We're getting to the spicy part, so I'm gonna add my spices now. In July of 2020, the trials officially began, and the details are truly some of the most horrific things I've ever heard, so I apologize in advance. It was argued in court that Mark did slay Dylan. In fact, he decapitated him on the living room floor and proceeded to scatter his body across the treacherous mountains that he lived in. And I think that people assume if you deep clean your whole house after a terrible event like this, that the traces of fluid just disappear. But this isn't the case at all. And there were traces of fluid found all over Mark's home, under rugs, furniture, and on an end table. Testing was able to confirm that yes, it was Dylan's. Search dogs were also able to pick up the scent of human remains in the back of Mark's truck, which he used to transport his son's body into the mountains to hide. Remember when I was talking about motive earlier? Well, that all came to light when Corey, Dylan's brother, filled the court in on what exactly they knew that their father didn't want them to. A year before the disappearance, Mark, Corey, and Dylan all went on a road trip, and Mark had brought along his laptop. One night, Corey and Dylan were messing around and found some highly disturbing photographs of their dad. Trigger warning, highly disturbing descriptions. These included images of him wearing women's clothing, makeup, and even consuming shit out of a diaper. Obviously, if you were to find a bunch of these pictures of your dad, it would freak you out. And Corey confronted Mark with what he saw, and this pissed him off. Clearly, he was embarrassed and horrified that his kids had seen these pictures. He thought that they would use it as blackmail or just try to ruin his life. And it was argued that the night Dylan landed in Durango, he talked to his dad about the photos, and Mark couldn't even handle the embarrassment and shame and attacked his son and ended his life. Okay, well, I think this is time for a plate. All right, so I have a bowl of rice. I'm gonna go ahead and move this over here. There were also multiple people who testified about the horrible anger issues that Mark had. He was verbally and mentally abusive to everyone and treated his kids like garbage. He was a weak man who couldn't handle being alone, and the second that someone had triggered him, he would set off. If it wasn't Dylan, there's a chance it could have been someone else. Mark Redwine argued that the disturbing photos were photoshopped by his ex-wife, Elaine. But then Mark's first wife testified in court and only echoed what Corey and Elaine had said. Mark was a scary person and was totally capable of doing something like this. She even testified that during their messy divorce, Mark threatened to kill his own children if that meant that she would never see them again. He even said that if he were to hide someone's body, that he would do it in the mountains. Mark and his defense tried to argue that all the claims were bogus and that they were just biased from the jump. They tried to say that all of Elaine's testimony should be thrown out because she was the one who started all the rumors that Mark was guilty. Mark never took the stand because he probably would have dug himself even further into his hole. His team argued that Dylan simply didn't want to be at his dad's house, ran away into the mountains in the middle of November, and got attacked by animals in the forest. Dylan's half-brother, the one from Arizona, took the stand and recalled meetings about searching for Dylan. He said he confronted Mark, questioning why he wasn't looking hard enough and why he didn't seem to be taking any of this seriously. He also testified that Mark kept saying Dylan had passed away from blunt force trauma, even before the remains, specifically the skull, were found. After the jury deliberated for about 6 hours, they came back to find Mark guilty of second-degree manslaughter and child abuse resulting in death. His sentencing is set for October of 2021, and Mark is looking at about 48 years in prison. All right, final touches. With that, my plant-based chili sin carne is ready. So I think that's all for today's episode. What do you guys think about this case? Let me know in the comments below. Ta-ta for now.